Day. Yesterday, 14th August, was a very important day, or so it seems, in the conflict in Ukraine, and not because of things that are taking place in Kursk region, but rather because of far more important events that are now unfolding close to the town of Pokrovsk in western Donbass. Now, I have been saying for some time, and ever since, in fact, the fall of Avdiivka, that it seemed to me that this is the area, the Avdiivka, Pokrovsk, or Cheretino area, which looks increasingly like the Schwerpunkt, the place of decision, if you like, the area where the Russians, having captured Avdiivka, have punched a hole through Ukrainian defenses, a hole which the Ukrainians seem unable to close, and where the Russians have exploited the fall of Avdiivka in order to gain basically what looks like a decisive advantage in the war, bringing it perhaps to its tipping point. And the point, the place where the tipping point, where everything converges, is this town of Pokrovsk. Now, after Avdiivka fell, the Russians started to push westwards, but they also pushed north towards the village of Cheretino, which they captured. And there was a lot of speculation at that time that what the Russians were intending to do was, once they'd captured Cheretino, they were going to start advancing northwards from Cheretino with a view to basically clearing up the Ukrainian defenses west of the H20 highway, east rather of the H20 highway, places like Alexandropil, Pantelimonivka, Valentinivka, Sukha Balka, and that would enable the Russians to surround, or at least to interfere with the supplies to the important town of Toretsk, big fortified town of Toretsk, which the Ukrainians were occupying close to the Russian-controlled city of Gorlovka, and that this advance that would happen to the northeast, effectively from Cheretino, would then enable the Russians, once they'd captured Chasiv Yar, to take the Ukrainian forces in the Toretsk area into a cauldron. Well, it hasn't turned out like that at all. That was not what the Russians chose to do. Instead of turning east, they moved west. And now that we are close to the point of decision, as I said, with the Russians closing in on Pokrovsk, we can start to see why. But firstly, what exactly is it that has happened over the last 24 hours that tells us that the situation in Pokrovsk, in and around Pokrovsk, is now very close to severe crisis? Well, yesterday we started to get a cascade of news about Russian advances in the Pokrovsk area. Now, we have to be careful because nearly all of these reports come from various blogging and reporting sites that provide information to the Russians and to the Ukrainians. All of these reports run far ahead of what we're getting from the Russian Defense Ministry itself. The only significant advance in this area that the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed is that they now confirm that the village of Ivanivka, which lies to the northwest of Progress, and which is to the north of the crucial TO 511 highway, has been fully cleared and is completely under Russian control. So the Russians now, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, control a group of villages, Timofeevka, Lysychny, Ivanivka, and Veselye. There are, however, other reports which tell an even more dramatic story, and they are they're most likely correct, at least in their general details, but we have to be a little careful before making assumptions that all of these reports are necessarily exactly correct. Firstly, there are reports that the Russians have now captured Zelensky, this village to the south of Veselye and Vovche, a major defense point for the Ukrainians. Apparently, it used to be a command post where the Ukrainians were located. There were reports that a Ukrainian grouping had been surrounded in the area of Zelensky. Well, we had no more information about that whatsoever, but it's possible, it's quite plausible that this is true. And then, shortly after, we got further news that a string of villages further west had also been captured by the Russians. These were apparently the villages of Orlovka, Zhuravka, and a village called Mykolaievka. Now, there is some intrigue about which village of Mykolaievka we're talking about, because there are actually 3 villages with that name in this area. One is located very close to Mirnograd, the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, just south of the main road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. I've discussed this key supply road at length in many programs, and I will return to it again later. I don't think this is the village that we're talking about. The Russians have captured other villages in this area, Timofeevka, Sviridonovka by some reports, but I don't think they've yet reached Mykolaievka, which is of all of the villages all of the Mykolaievkas that I'm going to discuss, it's the one that is closest to Mirnograd, to Pokrovsk itself. And if the Russians were in control of Mykolaievka, by the way, it would mean that the main supply road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka had in fact been severed. And as I'm not yet hearing reports that that is what has happened, I'm confident that we're not talking about that particular village of Mykolaievka. But there are 2 others. Now, one is immediately to the south of the village of Orlovka, which the Russians are supposed to have captured. And the other is to the north of the village of Zhuravka, that the Russians are also supposed to have captured. If it is the second of these 2 Mykolaievkas that the Russians have captured, then this Mykolaievka lies to the west of Grodivka, and it would imply that Grodivka, large village located on the TO 511 highway, which is the highway from Progress to Mirnograd, that the village of Grodivka had either fallen or was about to fall. It might be this village. Yesterday, I mentioned that there'd been a report from the TASS news agency which said that Ukrainian defenses in Grodivka were collapsing and that the Ukrainians were retreating from Grodivka, and that there was also a crumbling of Ukrainian defenses in the area of another village called Novogrodivka. Now, Novogorodivka lies immediately to the southwest of these two villages that we have heard have been captured, Orlovka and Zhuravka. So it could be that it's the southern Mykolaievka, which is south of Orlovka, or it could be that it's the northern Mykolaievka, which is west of Grodivka. I'm not sure which of the two it is. I'm going to take the conservative view and assume that it's the southern Mykolaievka, south of Orlovka and Zhuravka, which is the one that is located furthest of the three Mykolaievkas from Mirnograd. But it would mean that if this was so, then it would mean that the Russians have captured three villages, Mykolaievka, Orlovka, Zhuravka. They are close to outflanking Grodivka. According to the TASS report from yesterday, they're now pressing on Novogorodivka as well. The TASS report suggested that Novogorodivka is also likely to fall. And, well, that means that the Russians have cleared a whole cluster of villages immediately to the south of the TO511 highway, even as they're in the process, or rather have completed the capture of Ivanivka, which is to the north of the TO511 highway, and are apparently storming through Grodivka itself, which we are also being told is about to fall. I would finish by saying that if, as I said, it's the northern of these two Grodivkas that have fallen, the one that's north of Zhuravka, then it would suggest the two other villages, Krasny Yar and Kruty Yar, have probably also fallen, and that the Russians have captured Grodivka itself. But as I said, I'm going to take a more conservative, the most conservative of the three views. Now, having said all of that, if all of these villages have indeed been captured, then the Russians are deep inside what might be called the suburbs of Pokrovsk. They've not yet reached the town itself, but they are extremely close to doing so. In fact, one could go further and say that it looks as if the outermost defences of Pokrovsk are collapsing, and it would then be only a question of time before Grodivka itself falls. And once Grodivka falls, the Russians can then drive up the TO511 highway, and the next place along the highway after Grodivka, and no very great distance either, by the way, is Mirnograd, as I said, the western suburb of Pokrovsk. And with the Russians also in control of these villages to the south of Grodivka and the TO511 highway, it also looks as if the Russians are close to moving towards Pokrovsk itself. Yesterday, there were reports that the Russians are now some 10 kilometers from Pokrovsk. That presumably means the main part of Pokrovsk, west of Mirnograd. It looks to me as if they are much closer, according to the map, as if they are much closer to Mirnograd itself than that report says. I've heard it suggested that they're just, well, it was said a couple of days ago that they're just about 7 kilometers away. My guess is that they're now even closer to Mirnograd than that. Now, what does this mean? It does mean that the Russians are very close to Pokrovsk. Obviously, they have Pokrovsk well within artillery range now. The question is, are the Russians planning to storm Pokrovsk? Well, they have advanced a considerable distance from their original supply points. But to say this very simply, now that they control Ocheretino the villages of Olovo-Alexandrovka, Lozovatska, Timofeevka, Lizichne, Progress, Vovche, Ivanivka, and Veselye, and these villages to the south. It seems to me that they've just captured Juravka, Orlivka, Mykolaivka. It seems to me that they have a secure supply road. They can send their supplies to Ocheretino from Avdiivka. And of course, Avdiivka is close to Donetsk city, so they can send their supplies to Ocheretino. They can then send their supply lines moving along the TO511 highway, and that provides the Russians with a secure supply line, enabling them to close in further on Mirnograd itself. However, Mirnograd, Pokrovsk are not a small place, around 60,000 people. It could be that the events that took place last autumn with Kupiansk will repeat themselves. I remember that the Russians, during the latter weeks of Ukraine's summer offensive, began an advance towards Kupiansk. Many people, myself included, were wondering and speculating that the Russians were intending to recapture Kupiansk at that time. Eventually, they reached the village of Sinkovka, which lies immediately to the east of Kupiansk, and then they stopped. And they haven't gone beyond Sinkovka since. There were reports some days ago that they're now in the process of clearing Sinkovka, and that might be true, though I've heard nothing more about it since then. But anyway, they didn't take the full advantage of all the significant territorial gains that they had made up to that point to attack Kupiansk itself. Maybe they're going to do the same with Pokrovsk, that having reached Pokrovsk, as I say, a place of 60,000 people, they're going to stop, build up their forces, take Vozvyzhenka, cut the supply road to Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka and these other places, bide their time, and maybe, perhaps in the autumn or perhaps early next year, that's when they will decide that the moment has come to attack Pokrovsk. That would be consistent with the way the Russians have acted up to now over the course of this battle. But there is at least another possibility, which is that the Russians do intend to take Pokrovsk on the run. That having reached Pokrovsk, they're going to do what they did earlier in the war, when they reached Mariupol and then Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and by the way of Avdiivka and Chasov Yar and all of these places, which is that they're not going to stop, that they're going to continue the advance, and that they're going to penetrate and attack Pokrovsk itself. I think a lot depends on how well defended Pokrovsk at this point is. And this is where the speed of the Russian advance westwards raises the question of whether, in fact, Pokrovsk is particularly well defended. Now, other Donbass towns that the Russians have sought to capture, places like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Donetsk, Seversk, have been very heavily fortified over many years by the Ukrainians. One gets the sense that this has not been true of Pokrovsk, and that the defences around Pokrovsk, to the extent that they exist at all, have been very hurriedly improvised over the last few weeks, basically since the fall of Avdiivka. So we're not looking at fortified positions that are as strong as the fortifications created in the Donbass cities, the eastern Donbass cities. It's also the case that the speed of the Russian advance suggests that there are not many Ukrainian troops in this area, and that there are not many Ukrainian troops available, therefore, to defend Pokrovsk, which would be astonishing if it were true, but it might be true. There is one further fact which, to my mind, suggests that the Ukrainians are not ready to defend Pokrovsk, that events have happened far more quickly than they anticipated, and that they've taken no step really to prepare Pokrovsk for defense from the Russians. And that is that I have heard no reports up to now of any evacuation of civilians from Pokrovsk. Usually, when the Russians reach a city or town in Ukraine, the Ukrainian authorities do what they are expected to do, which is arrange an evacuation. But there doesn't seem to be any information that they have so far taken that step with Pokrovsk itself. They did it with Bakhmut, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Mariupol, all of these other places. But there's no word so far that I'm aware of that they have begun an evacuation of Pokrovsk. That suggests that they did not expect the Russians to come so fast, so far, that they did not expect to be fighting in Pokrovsk at this point, and that this has all come as a shock for them. There is another fact which might suggest that the Ukrainians are not prepared for this battle, and that is that there has been yet more airstrikes or missile strikes on a military airfield near to a place called Mirnograd. Now, I have assumed all along that this airfield is near to the town of Mirnograd, the western suburb of Mirnograd, the western suburb of Pokrovsk, called Mirnograd. And that remains my operative assumption. If people know otherwise, I would be grateful to know. But the day before yesterday, the Russians carried out another missile strike on this same airfield and destroyed a Ukrainian Sukhoi 27 fighter jet that was located on this airfield. That suggests that the airfield is still in use. And again, I would have thought that the Ukrainians would not be keeping valuable fighter jets on an airfield which they thought was threatened in the way that it presumably would be if the Russians are as close to Pokrovsk and Mirnograd as indeed they now are. So there we go. That's possible, that there are no very strong defences in Mirnograd, that there are no large concentrations of Ukrainian troops able to hold positions there. And, well, it may be that the Russians are going to be able to take Pokrovsk on the run. Now, let's just, at this point, go ahead of ourselves and ask ourselves what that would mean. Firstly, if Pokrovsk falls, then obviously the great supply line, the great supply road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar is cut. Also, it turns out that Pokrovsk is also located at a junction point of many of the main railways that one finds in Donbass. And if one actually reduces the map, rather looks beyond Pokrovsk itself, a number of things become fairly obvious. If you continue to follow the main road from Pokrovsk, if you don't stop at Pokrovsk, but continue to go westwards, then before very long, you arrive at the city of Pavlograd, about 100,000 people, rather bigger than Pokrovsk. And then immediately beyond Pavlograd, or very close to Pavlograd, but west of it, you arrive at the Dnieper. And the Dnieper When you arrive there at the Dnieper, you are opposite the great industrial city of Dnipro, of which, by the way, there are parts also on the east bank of the Dnieper. Now, as I understand it, the way in which Ukraine receives its supplies, sends its supplies to its troops, is that they're sent from the west along the railways and the roads, principally to Dnipro. They then cross the bridges across the Dnieper, which are located in Dnipro, and then they move along the great supply road to Pokrovsk, through Pavlograd to Pokrovsk, and from there they are distributed to the various Ukrainian forces across the Donbass. So if Pokrovsk falls, that obviously cannot happen. The Ukrainians will have lost their main supply route. There is another supply route which goes from Kiev, partly through Kharkiv, through the town of ETHEREUM in southern Kharkiv region, and eventually arrives at Slavyansk. That's the supply road to northern Donbass. There are apparently no others to speak of. The Russians at one point cut the northern supply road when they captured ETHEREUM in, I believe it was March 2022, but they withdrew from ETHEREUM during Ukraine's autumn 2022 Kharkiv offensive. They found themselves overextended there, and they appear to have discovered that the main supply road that the Ukrainians were using was the one that went through Pokrovsk. It is possible that if Pokrovsk falls, the Russians will act to cut the other supply route. Again, the one that goes through ETHEREUM. And of course, that then explains some of the more recent Russian moves. It explains the very complicated operations that the Russians are carrying out in the area to the immediate east of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, where they've been steadily capturing villages and bringing their positions ever closer to the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, and have been preparing eventually for the recapture of Kupiansk and perhaps for an advance towards ETHEREUM. And it could be also that all the operations around Siversk are also intended to do that, in which case the supply roads, all the main supply roads to Donbass would be cut, and the entire grouping, Ukrainian grouping in Donbass, would be cut off from supplies. There are apparently no other good roads that the Ukrainians could use to keep their forces supplied, and with Pokrovsk under Russian control, the main railway lines would also have been cut also. But anyway, we're moving too far ahead. We don't yet know what the Russians are going to do in the north. I think that probably the kind of operations I'm talking about are indeed in the works, but suffice to say that if Pokrovsk is captured, Ukrainian supply roads, supply positions to eastern Donbass, the northeastern Donbass, central and northeastern Donbass, become very precarious. They have to depend completely on the one remaining supply road through ETHEREUM and the railway connections that happen there, that exist there. But more important, immediately, if Pokrovsk were to fall, it's obvious that all of the Ukrainian positions in southern Donbass, in Kurakovo, in Vuhledar, all of these places would be rapidly cut off from supplies. The Russians have already taken steps, as I've explained in many programs, to begin a steady encirclement of Vuhledar. They are now just north of Vuhledar, having crossed the road between Vuhledar and Konstantinovka. The supply situation for Vuhledar is already becoming difficult. But of course, if Pokrovsk falls, it's only a question of time before Ukrainian positions in Kurachovo, Selidovo, Vuhledar itself become untenable. And then, of course, a whole huge belt of territory passes under Russian control in southern Donbass. And then something else starts to become possible, because with the Russians in Pokrovsk, they can then conceivably start a further advance west towards Pavlograd and ultimately to the Dnieper River, bringing them directly opposite Dnipro and, by the way, Zaporozhye city, which is not located that far to the south. Now that, again, is probably an event that is some weeks away or months away, or perhaps quite a long time away. But if Pokrovsk falls, all of these possibilities start to come together. So we are now in a situation where we must start thinking about these possibilities, because the Russians are at the gateway. Not at the gateway, they're knocking on the door of Pokrovsk itself. I don't know how strong Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk are. I don't know what the nature of Russian plans are. I don't know the size of the Russian grouping that is advancing on Pokrovsk. I'm guessing that we're looking at about 10,000, 15,000 troops heading in this direction. They've recently been supplemented by a division force, so maybe 20,000 is a more accurate, correct number. But I don't know how many Russian troops there are in this area overall. All I will say is that it does seem to me as if there is at least a possibility that the Russians might be planning to take Pokrovsk on the run, and that the Ukrainians are too disorganized and too weak in this part of the conflict zone to resist them. We'll have to see, but these are serious questions, and if Pokrovsk does indeed fall, then, as I said, we've reached the crisis point in the war, the moment when the entire supply situation for Ukraine in Donbass begins to unravel, and unravel fast. So that's already a major crisis in the Pokrovsk area. Now, there are lots of other problems facing the Ukrainian grouping in Donbass as well. Firstly, we've had a further crisis. We have continuing problems near Vuhledar. I've already touched on those. As I say, Vuhledar is now very close to becoming completely encircled, and one wonders what plan the Ukrainians have for that. These events near Pokrovsk explain the recent Russian advances towards north of Staromayorsk and Urozhanye in the Vremevka salient area, and the Russian probing attacks towards the town of Gulyapolye and conceivably Orechov. Because, of course, if all of these places are captured by the Russians over the course of the next few weeks, and if Vuhledar is also captured by the Russians, and if the Russians are able to open up all the railways in this area also, then they're in a good position to start advancing northwards, and we might even conceivably have a situation where the Russians push on along the TO511 highway from Pokrovsk to Pavlograd, and that they are simultaneously advancing on Pavlograd from the south, which would be a very critical situation for Ukraine. But anyway, we have a developing crisis in western Donbass. What's happening elsewhere? Well, it looks as if in Toretsk, this other big fortified city, Russian advances there are continuing unabated. It looks as if the Russians are gradually, well, not gradually at all. There are reports that they now either control all of New York or most of New York. The most conservative figure I've seen for Russian control of New York is that they control around 80% of this big village. They've also been pushing towards the various villages to the west of the H20 highway, gradually clearing up those villages as well. There's probably quite a lot of fighting in the Toretsk area still coming, but it does look as if the Russians are going to achieve their breakthrough in Toretsk. As I said earlier in the program, they didn't need to cross the H20 highway and attack all those villages to the west, to the east of it. They've been able to carry out a head-on attack on the Toretsk positions, and we are now becoming within distance of Toretsk itself falling. And the fact that we are getting a lot less news from Chasiv Yar further north still, far from being a positive sign for the Ukrainians or a sign that the Russians have redeployed forces from Chasiv Yar to Kursk region. A fact which has been denied, by the way, by the Ukrainian soldiers on the spot. Well, all of that suggests that the situation for the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar is deteriorating as well. And, well, I've already discussed the Seversk-Kupiansk battlefronts in some detail. All I will say is that further north still, in Kharkiv region, there is no evidence that group of forces north, which also has responsibility for the situation in Kursk region, has redeployed any of its infantry from Volchansk. They've recently conducted more assaults in Volchansk. They're taking under their control more of the urban territory in Volchansk, still systematically clearing the high-rise buildings there. And they also seem to be well on the way to, they've resumed their attempts to capture the village of Lipsy, which would give them the high ground immediately north of Kharkiv city, and which would put them in a position where they can conduct continuous artillery attacks on Kharkiv, as they were doing, by the way, for a period of time in 2022. So, very dramatic news on the battlefronts in Donbass. There is, as I said, still a faint question mark over some of this, whether the Russian advances in the Pokrovsk area have been quite as fast as the information we're getting from Russian sources suggests, is something that at the moment we cannot absolutely confirm. But the Russian Defense Ministry does say that Ivanivka has been captured. They are increasingly referring, I noticed, to Grodivka in their daily updates. It does look as if the Russians now are coming very, very dangerously close to Pokrovsk, that the battle for Pokrovsk is soon going to be underway. And to be frank, as of this time, as far as I can tell, the Ukrainians are completely unprepared for it. Well, now that brings us to the situation in Kursk region. This is the area which has been attracting by far the most attention. I ought to say that in Donbass, every day, according to the Russians, the Ukrainians now lose around 2,000 men, dead and wounded. In the Kursk region, the Ukrainians lose between 200 and 400 men a day. A significant level of loss, but of course it remains a sideshow relative to the far more dramatic fighting, the really heavy fighting that is taking place in Donbass. And to repeat a point which I have made several times on these programs, but which really does merit repeating, unless the Ukrainians are able to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, and then the entire operation in Kursk region is meaningless. Capturing tiny villages in Kursk region, some of which are so small that I am unable to locate them on the maps, probably because they're not shown on the maps at all. Capturing, tiny villages is completely inconsequential. It's just rattling around in a box, suffering very, very heavy losses, to no purpose. Now, before I discuss the situation in Kursk region based on what the Russian Defense Ministry is telling us, I think that the most important development that's happened, or rather over the last couple of days, is confirmation of the very, very substantial defense lines that the Russians have been building close to, in the area of the nuclear power plant and to the village of Lgov and Risk and all of these places which are in the vicinity of the power station. Now, the Ukrainians have never managed to break through to this area, despite various claims, but we're now getting lots of drone and satellite footage which shows huge trench works being created by the Russians. The Russians have been busy building fortifications. The meeting in Moscow 3 days ago, which was chaired by Putin himself, spoke about concrete bunkers and being created. Perhaps we're going to start to see dragon's teeth and all of that. Some people are seeing this as evidence that the Russians are panicking, that the situation in Kursk region is deteriorating. It suggests nothing of the kind. I said fairly early on in the Kursk Operation that given the importance of the power station and given that it is clearly the ultimate target that the Ukrainians have in mind, the very first thing that the Russians would do would be to secure the area around the nuclear power plant. And that is exactly what they are doing. That's why they're fortifying this area and why they're sending most of their reinforcements to this area. And far from being a sign that the Ukrainians are achieving progress in the Kursk area, the fact that the Russians have successfully built many of these fortified lines already. They're not just trenches, there's huge ditches and things of this kind, concrete things like this. All of that suggests to me that by this point in the battle, the Kursk nuclear power plant is definitely beyond Ukraine's reach, in light of which rattling around, fighting over tiny villages of a few dozens of people makes no sense whatsoever and is instead a reckless and pointless waste of scarce resources. Now, Having said that, let's now deal with the information that we've been getting from the Russian Defense Ministry. And interestingly enough, it has come, it's been pouring in very rapidly over the last few hours. Firstly, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with a update of a meeting, a further meeting that the new Russian Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov, had with various military and civilian officials discussing the situation on Russia's western border. And I'll read the report briefly. It says that Russian Defense Minister holds meetings on security issues of border regions of Russian Federation. We're told that that the meetings covered specifically the situation in Kursk, Bryansk and Belgorod region. And then we're told that during the meeting today, that's to say 15th August, additional measures were discussed to ensure the integrity and security of the territory, as well as to protect the population and infrastructure in Belgorod region from Ukrainian attacks. And then we were given a further report. We plan to hear a concrete action plan prepared by the General Staff on additional measures. These are words by Belousov. We talk about, first of all, improving the effectiveness of the military command and control system in cooperation with other law enforcement agencies and administration of Belgorod region, defining responsible officials and providing additional forces and facilities that are to be deployed to carry out basic tasks. Belousov noted that he is going to supervise the implementation of the presented plan personally. And then we're told who attended the meeting, and it was the governor of Belgorod region, Vyacheslav Gladkov, deputy ministers of defense of the Russian Federation, Lieutenant General Andrei Buliga and Alexei Krivoruchko, as well as representatives of the Presidential Executive Office of Russia. And the last, I suspect, is a way of referring to Alexei Dyumin, who Russian reports are suggesting is now the overall official, civilian official, in overall charge of the whole situation along the border. Now, there has been no confirmation of this from the Kremlin. The Kremlin has not confirmed that Dyumin himself has been appointed to this role. But there have been so many media reports to this effect that I personally am sure that it is the case. And I am now going to return to the topic of the source I have, who has been contacting me extensively over the last couple of days, providing me with updates about the situation on the ground in Kursk region, wherever, but also discussing Russian tactics and strategy. This is the same source that told me that the Russians, some time ago, worked out that the Ukrainians were intending to launch an attack on Kursk region. He's reminded me several times correctly that he tipped me off that this was going to happen 2 months ago, or 2 months before the operation itself began. He's provided me with details of the steps that the Russians took to prepare for this operation, the special forces units that were deployed to the area of Kursk, and the tactics, the ambush tactics that would be used. And yesterday in my program, I speculated that perhaps the Russians had received a tip-off that there was indeed going to be a Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, and that the political leadership in Moscow did not accept this information, but that someone in Moscow decided to take this information seriously, and that it was this person who deployed or decided to deploy special forces units, Wagner forces, and the Chechen fighters to Kursk region, and to ensure that they were already there in order to be prepared to conduct operations in Kursk when the Ukrainians came. And I wondered aloud who that person might be. Well, the source has come back. He's provided me with more information about the fighting, but he's told me two things. Firstly, the Russian official who took the decision to deploy special forces and the Chechen fighters and the Wagner people to Kursk region was none other than Alexei Dyumin. And it is completely consistent with what we know about the man. He is himself, by background, a former special forces officer. He's also worked for the FSB. He is the sort of person who would understand how to do these things and who would be expected to put together in an operation of this kind. For the record, my source thinks that it might just be possible that Dyumin did indeed undertake these measures on his own initiative. But my source thinks it's unlikely. He thinks much more plausibly this was decided with the full knowledge of the Russian military and political leadership. He has also, by the way, provided me with information about the very, very extensive Russian forces that are available to be deployed in this area, the heavy mechanized units, that they do indeed exist in substantial number, though for the moment they continue to be held back. I'll discuss shortly why. And he also provided me with more information about the ambush tactics that the Russians are undertaking in Kursk region. Now, I want to just come back to the point that I've made previously. If one has doubts about information that has been provided to you, but if, as more and more information comes your way, which tallies with the information that you're being provided, then clinging on to your doubts begins to become misguided. One has to start accepting the information as true. And from this point onwards, having now reached this point, having seen things play out exactly as this source said, I'm going to accept his information as true. I'm not going to discuss it further. I don't think there's any value in doing so. I suspect, as I said, that there's a very complex story behind all of this. But I think that we are at that point now where I just have to accept that the source is right and has almost certainly been right all along, and leave it at that. Now, why are the heavy mechanized units not being deployed in the battle up to this point? The reason is because the Russian forces, the special forces who are located in this area, in the Kursk area, are busy doing their job, which is inflicting massive damage on the Ukrainians in conjunction with the Russian Air Force and the Russian artillery and the Russian missile forces. And in the meantime, the Russians are doing exactly what they did in advance of Ukraine's Zaporozhye offensive. They're treating the area where the fighting is being carried out by small special forces ambush units as a kind of repeat of the way in which similar small special forces units operated during Ukraine's Zaporozhye offensive in the summer of 2023. These small forces, these small groups of men, highly trained, highly motivated, very powerfully armed with anti-tank weapons and that kind of thing, were deployed north of the heavy fortified positions. The tank barriers and all of that, and engaged the Ukrainian tanks and forces there in what at the time I referred to as the zone of control. That the same thing is happening, that in effect a zone of control in Kursk is being created. The big difference is that whereas in the fighting in Zaporozhye region, the great fortified positions, the Surovikin line, had been created before the fighting began. In Kursk region, it is being created even as the fighting continues to be underway. And that is exactly what we are seeing. Can I say, by the way, that we are not going to see something on the same scale as the Surovikin line, despite certain claims to the contrary. The territory that the Ukrainians control is significantly smaller than some are suggesting. In fact, it's, as we'll see shortly, a relatively confined area. You don't need to create anything on the same scale as the Surovikin line in order to bring the situation under control. So that's what the Russians are going to do. They're going to box the Ukrainians in with fortified lines, keep them, attack them with, as I said, these tactical forces. Then when the Ukrainians are sufficiently weakened and enough forces have been put together, the Russians can then move forward and can start committing the mechanized troops to the battle. And we see that Belousov, the defense minister, has just had a meeting. The general staff were attending. Plans for Belgorod region were being prepared. And similar plans, of course, have also happened for Kursk region. Only the Russian Defense Ministry is not telling us about those because obviously that is classified, but they've confirmed that Belousov has had a succession of meetings covering what is happening in the different border regions, Bryansk, Belgorod and Kursk. So let us now turn to the situation in Kursk region. And the place to start is with what the Russians are telling us about the situation in Kursk region. And this is what the Russians say. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to repel the Ukrainian attempt to invade the territory of the Russian Federation. Group of Forces North's intensive operations, air and artillery strikes have repelled an attack launched by assault detachments of the 115th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian army in the direction of Kremyanoye. Now, Kremyanoye is a village which is north of Suja. In fact, it is northwest of Suja. It's near another village called Olgovka, and Olgovka itself is not so far from Korenovo. It's in the general area where the Ukrainians have been trying to advance northwards. And the Ukrainians have been sending their forces north, apparently from a place called Svedlikovo, which lies directly north of the border. They tried to push north. They were caught by a group of forces north near Kremyanoye, and according to the Russian Defense Ministry, they were defeated there. And then the Defense Ministry, that, by the way, appears to have been the main Ukrainian attack in the Kursk area over the last 24 hours. And then Group of Forces North tells us Russian troops have repelled further attacks by hitting concentration areas of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade south of Kremyanoye, this same village, and of the 80th Air Assault Brigade west of Ruskaya Konyopielka. I am not sure where that is. There are lots of little villages in this area. It's very difficult for me to say exactly where they are located exactly. And the article then goes, the report from the Defense Ministry says enemy losses were up to 90 servicemen, 5 US infantry, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 5 in Bradleys, of which the Ukrainians, to repeat again, do not have that many, and 6 armoured fighting vehicles. So this is fighting that is happening in the area of Kremyanoye. Kremyanoye is located east of Korenovo and south of the village of Olgovka and Durovivka and Zhuravli. There have been various claims that the Ukrainians control some of these villages, Olgovka, Durovka and Zhuravli. But the fact that there has been a battle happening near Kremyanoye, to my mind, suggests otherwise. It suggests that the Russians control all of these villages, or at least have occasional control of these villages. Maybe these villages are all in the grey zone, and that might apply to Kremyanoye itself. So the Ukrainians attempted another advance northward, ultimately towards the nuclear power station. That's the objective. But they were pushed back. That's what the Russians tell us. That's what the Russian Defense Ministry tell us. And they were pushed back after a very heavy defeat. And then the Defense Ministry goes on to say Russian troops have routed the enemy units and restored control over Krupets. Now, Krupets is a tiny place. You won't find it on any map. It is a farmstead, and it is not located anywhere in this area. It is located to the southeast of Sudzha, not far from the border. The Ukrainians sent a column of troops pushing towards the village of Belitsa. It was finally caught at a place called Giri. The Russians defeated it there. It was pushed back, and the Russians seem to be pursuing these Ukrainian troops who were defeated at Giri. And it looks as if this particular column is being slowly and effectively destroyed. And then the Defense Ministry report says that Army aviation, drones and artillery have foiled attempts of mobile enemy groups, these are reconnaissance groups, to break through to Russian territory close to Varvarovka, Safonovka, Septuchovka, Kauchuk, Alexeyevskoye, and Matveyevka. I do not know where some of these places are, but Kauchuk and Alexeyevskoye are located in this same area that I have been talking about, where the Ukrainians launched their attack. They've been trying to push through to Kromsky Biki. It looks as if it's in that sort of general area. Kauchuk is certainly in that kind of area. Again, these are reconnaissance groups also trying to move towards the nuclear power station, or the general area of the nuclear power station. And the Russians have been successfully intercepting and defeating them. This is what the Defense Ministry says, and it is, again, just to repeat, it correlates exactly with the information that this source was giving me, that whenever the Ukrainians try to move forward in these sort of columns, they get ambushed in the woods by the light the Special Forces infantry, the Chechens, and by the tanks, the Russian tanks, which the Russian Defense Ministry has previously told us are located in this area. And then we're told that Russian units have hit manpower and hardware clusters of the night, and then there's a list of Ukrainian brigades, 22nd, 61st Mechanized, 92nd Air Assault Brigade, 95th Air Assault Brigade, 1st National Guard Brigade, and 129th Territorial Defence Brigade. It seems that only battalions or even smaller units of these brigades are actually located in this area. The Ukrainians, again, have created Frankenstein units by bringing together units of different brigades. Anyway, the Russians say that they've attacked these forces close to Olgovka, Snagast. These again are the villages to the west. Pogreki, which is located to the north of Malaya Loknaya, which some reports say the Russians have already captured. Mirnoye, Zauleshenka, Uspenovka, and Yuzhnoye. I do not know where some of these places are, just to say again. And then we're told that an Iskander-M operational missile destroyed a convoy of 15 fuel supply vehicles close to Lubny in Sumy region. There are, in fact, some reports that the Ukrainians are running short of fuel in this area, that their supply positions are not particularly strong. We're told that the Russian Air Force attacked Ukrainian reserves, ammunition and supply depots close to Yunakovka, Khoteny and Kondratovka, which are also in Sumy region. And then we're going to get a list of Ukrainian losses. Over the past 24 hours, Ukrainian losses were more than 340 Ukrainian troops. That's dead and wounded. Again, a very high number. 19 armoured vehicles, including 5 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 14 armoured fighting vehicles, 8 motor vehicles, 5 field artillery systems, 2 Enclave N and Bukovel AD electronic warfare systems. And then we're given a list that since the beginning of hostilities in Kursk region, the enemy has lost up to 2,640 troops, that's dead and wounded, 37 tanks. Notice that we've been hearing less about tanks being destroyed, but interestingly, a video has appeared today which shows what appears to be a British Challenger tank in precisely this area, which has just been knocked out by the Russians. Just saying. So maybe that's the next tank. We'll probably be hearing more about it in tomorrow's update. 32 armoured personnel carriers, 23 armoured infantry fighting vehicles, nearly all of those Bradleys, 206 armoured fighting vehicles, 96 motor vehicles, 4 air defence systems, 3 multiple launch rocket system launchers, 20 field artillery systems, and 3 electronic warfare stations. The operation to neutralise the Ukrainian units is in progress. Now, we have had a supplement to this information from the Russian Defense Ministry by our old friend Apti Alaudinov, the Chechen Special Forces officer. And here I'm going to just make a further observation in further corroboration of the information provided to me by my source. He told me that some weeks ago the Russians had redeployed Chechen units to Kursk region, where they were trained and prepared for the Ukrainian insertion, that the Akhmat Special Forces unit had been deployed to this precise area. Now, some time ago, I noticed that there were reports that this unit had become attached to Group of Forces North, and Alaudinov was very active and very busy and giving commentaries all of the time. I thought for a time that these forces, the Akhmat Special Forces, had been deployed to Volchansk and to the fighting in Volchansk. But as I now remember, I never heard any evidence that they had actually engaged the Ukrainians in fighting there. So it looks as if the Chechen forces were indeed attached to Group of Forces North, but most probably, corroborating what this source says, they were deployed to Kursk region and prepared for this operation that is now unfolding, where of course they are particularly skilled at these kind of ambush tactics. Anyway, there we are. So let's get to what the Russians are, what Abdialudinov rather is now telling us, and he discusses the situation on the battlefront, and he provides us a little more detail than we're getting from the Russian Defense Ministry. He says, we have already cleared one locality, Martinovka, of Ukrainian troops. So that confirms that Martinovka is indeed under Russian control. He has previously said, in contradiction to Ukrainian claims, that the Russians still have a presence in Sudzha, the village, the town rather, on the border. There have been many claims that the Ukrainians control Sudzha. Alaudinov disputes this, and he's just again saying that the Russians control Martinovka. He said that, and two more, and he says we have already cleared one locality, Martinovka, of Ukrainian troops. Two more, he says that Martinovka, in other words, is under Russian control, and that is fully consistent with what I have always believed, what I have believed ever since the Russians first recaptured Martinovka some days ago. And then he goes on to say two more localities, Cherkasskoye Porechnoye and Ruskoye Porechnoye, are currently being mopped up. Now, those are two villages to the west of the places we've been talking about, to the west of Martinovka. I discussed yesterday that the Russian Defense Ministry spoke about a battle with the Ukrainians in precisely this area. This is presumably what Alaudinov is now referring to. He suggests that the Russians have indeed regained control of these villages if they were ever under Ukrainian control, and that the Ukrainians are being cleared, pushed out of them. There have been many reports that the Russians also control a village called Malaya Loknaya further to the west. Who knows? But anyway, that is what, to repeat again, Alaudinov is telling us. And he goes on to say that the Ukrainians had been pulling everything they could to these settlements with a view to breaching Russian defenses and establishing a route to push deeper into Russia, as they realized that Russian forces had been holding them off. But he basically tells us that the operation has been unsuccessful. The Ukrainian operation had been unsuccessful, that the Ukrainians have been attacking towards Martinovka, they've been trying to push up the road towards Kursk and the nuclear power station, but all of their attacks have been unsuccessful. Now, if we put all of these reports together, we arrive at the conclusion that the actual territory that the Ukrainians control is not that enormous. Zelensky, Syrskyi have been talking about 1,000+ kilometers, 78 or is it 100, whatever it is, communities that the Ukrainians control in this area. It seems that is an exaggeration. The Ukrainians seem to control an area of territory, basically from Snagust in the west, or rather they have a presence from Snagust in the west, northwards towards places like Olgovka and Kremyanoye and Pogrebki, and the Russians have, and then south towards Kazachaya, Lochnia, and they also control at least some of Suja, most of Suja. Perhaps they even control all of Suja. I don't know. But this is the area under where at least the Ukrainians have established a presence. And I get the strong sense that the actual position of the bulk of the Ukrainian troops is not located across this whole territory, but in isolated pockets, most of which are strung out along the border itself. So the Russians creating fortified positions, and they're sending their own ambush parties to take on the Ukrainians there. And as we can see, the Ukrainians, as a result, suffering significant losses every day. Now, I'm spending a huge amount of time discussing the Kursk Operation. And to be clear, if the Kursk Operation had resulted in the capture of the nuclear power plant, it would have merited it. But I think that is now almost certainly out of reach. The Russian fortifications that are being built around the Kursk nuclear power plant almost certainly place it fully out of reach. What is happening is that the Ukrainians are continuing to lose troops in Kursk region, some of their best troops, some of their best remaining material, even as this massive crisis that I was talking about earlier in this program in the Pokrovsk area, but also a secondary crisis in the Donetsk area, even as that is developing. This has been a grotesque, absurd misallocation of resources. But instead of putting his troops out, Zelensky is doubling down. He's talking about creating a buffer zone, which, by the way, also, to my mind, suggests that the idea of capturing the nuclear power plant has been abandoned. The Ukrainians perhaps now realize that it is out of reach. But anyway, he's talking about creating a buffer zone, establishing some kind of administration over these scattered and largely deserted villages. The Russians, by the way, say that the vast majority of people who live in Kursk region are now safe. They say that that the majority of Kiev residents have been evacuated and are safe. The majority of residents in the border areas of Kursk region, this is from the Russian Emergency Ministry, have been temporarily resettled and are safe now. Over the past 24 hours, more than 720 people have been moved to secure areas either independently or in organized convoys. And we are then told that the total number of people in temporary shelters, 177 temporary shelters, are already operating in 14 regions. Nearly 9,500 people, including more than 2,500 children, are staying in them. So, and then they say that they have additional shelters for Kursk regiments, residents throughout the country, and they could house another 36,000 people. But overall, most of the people have been relocated from the area. Notice that 9,500, that gives us an indication of how thinly populated this territory, where the Ukrainians now have a presence, actually is. And the Russians have previously said that only 2,000 people are unaccounted for. So who exactly is Zelensky going to administer? Who are the people who are going to be administered by the Ukrainian authorities in this area? It's a fantasy. It is nonsense. So he's tripling down on an operation which bears all the hallmarks of having failed, and which he is turning from a failure, though it must be said a media success. He's busy turning it into an outright debacle. But that's not surprising. That's perhaps what you would expect. Meanwhile, we now have an article in the New York Times which all but admits that it is game over for Ukraine, that the war in Ukraine is almost lost. The article goes with the title, "Putin has victory in his grasp," and they suggest that it might be the time to go back and to revisit Putin's proposals for a complete Ukrainian withdrawal from the 4 regions and for Ukraine to confirm neutrality. But of course, that doesn't acknowledge the fact that the Russians are now saying that the whole idea of negotiations is off the table, that as a result of the Kursk Operation, the idea of negotiations is off the table. And perhaps not coincidentally, we are now also getting articles appearing which tell us that the Democratic Party's candidate, Vice President Harris, doesn't get on especially well with President Zelensky. It is difficult to understand the military logic of what Zelensky, Syrsky and Budanov have done. It's been suggested that this event has lifted morale amongst the Ukrainian soldiers in Donbass. I wonder whether that is really so. But if the battle for Pokrovsk begins, if Pokrovsk falls, then I suspect that the questions about the wisdom of this operation will multiply, and then Zelensky might find himself, for all I know, in very serious political trouble. But that is a topic for another day. I'm going to finish this program here today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can get all the amazing things we have there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.